The Shade and the Healer. Episode 2 of The Midnight Healer. World context previously in Episode 1. Ayla Voss healed a veiled dock worker in secret during the witching window, absorbing a wound that should have killed him and burning it through Veilport's ley lines. The effort cost her 3 days of vitality. As she returned to Voss and Vine Apothecary at dawn, she found a man she did not recognize standing in the alley behind her shop, tall, charcoal coat, eyes going black at the edges. He said only, "We need to talk about the Ashening." Cliffhanger. Episode 2 begins now. Flashback, 6 years prior Veilport underground tunnels. The tunnels beneath Veilport were old in the way that mattered, not old in years, but old in memory. They had been dug by veiled hands in the city's founding century, carved through bedrock threaded with ley lines so that the underground would hum with residual power. A constant low vibration that the uninitiated would mistake for tinnitus, and the knowing would recognize as the city's pulse. In the years since, the tunnels had been used for everything from Veil courier routes to contraband magical item transport to the desperate flights of the unregistered. Tonight, they were a hunting ground. Kade Morrow was 27 years old, and he was very good at his job. He moved through the dark in the way all shades are trained to move, low center of gravity, each footstep placed before the weight transferred, shoulders loose. His long form was fitted tonight in Veil Enforcer's tactical black, close cut, reinforced at the joints, the silver insignia on his chest catching no light at all because the insignia, like everything the Veil made, was designed to swallow light rather than reflect it. At his throat, fitted close as a second skin, was the collar. Matte gunmetal. No buckle. No seam. It suppressed his shade ability the way a clamp suppresses a bleeding wound, completely, painfully, and with the implicit message that the organ it controlled was considered dangerous by someone other than himself. He had worn it for 4 years. He had stopped feeling it after the first 6 months. That was the thing about containment. You stopped feeling it precisely when it had done its full work. He found her in the 4th sublevel, in a drainage alcove that smelled of iron and old rain, crouched behind a fallen section of Victorian-era pipe with her arms wrapped around her knees and her power leaking from her in the way unregistered power always leaked. Messy, unconscious, like a wound that doesn't know it's bleeding. She was 16, maybe 17. Black jeans, a school hoodie with the name of a high school he recognized 2 miles east of the docks. Ordinary neighborhood, ordinary life. Her sneakers were soaked through. Her hands, pressed flat against the concrete as though she needed to feel its solidity, were shaking. The power coming off her was not aggressive. It was not weaponized. It was the raw, unformed shimmer of something immense and untrained, the way a river looks when it hasn't yet found its banks. She didn't know what she was doing. She probably didn't know what she was. She had run down here because she was frightened of something above ground, frightened of herself, maybe, or of what she'd done, and the tunnels had called to her the way ley lines always called to the veiled, the way home calls to the lost. Kade stood at the edge of the alcove for 11 seconds. He counted them. She didn't see him. Her eyes were pressed shut, her lips moving in something that was not a spell. It was too irregular, too desperate, but might have been a prayer, or the kind of self-instruction you give yourself when you are trying very hard not to fall apart. Don't. Stop it. Stop. He thought about his orders. They were clear. They were always clear. An unregistered veiled individual, category undetermined, power output flagged by 3 separate detection nodes in the Veil's underground grid. Intercept. Assess. If benign, bring in for processing. If unstable, neutralize the power signature and bring in for processing. Bring in for processing. That was the destination in either case. That was always the destination. He knew what processing meant. He had been present for 2 of them. He had stood in the corridor outside and listened to the sound of the machines and had told himself that the Veil knew what it was doing, that the law existed for reasons, that the alternative, unregistered, untrained, uncontrolled power loose in a city of 300,000, was worse. He looked at the girl. He looked at her shaking hands and her soaked shoes and her school hoodie and the way her lips were moving in that desperate, private incantation against herself. He took one step backward, then another. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, each footstep placed as carefully as before, the sound of his boots on stone no louder than the dripping water. He did not look back. He filed his report 4 hours later. Sitting in a Veilfield office that smelled of institutional coffee and old paper, under fluorescent lights that buzzed with a frequency he'd always found slightly nauseating, he wrote, "Target located in Sublevel 4, Sector 9. No contact established. Subject relocated prior to engagement. Trail went cold. Recommend redeployment of detection assets." Every word technically accurate. Every word a lie in the way that only omissions can be. The superior signed off on the report at 3:47 in the morning. Kade went home. He slept 4 hours. When he woke, he told himself he had done the right thing. He found out 9 days later. He wasn't supposed to be in that corridor. He had come back to the field office to retrieve a personal item, a book he'd left in his locker, which tells you something about what kind of man he was, that this detail matters, that he had come back for a book, and he had taken the wrong turn, or the right turn. Depending on how you understood the relationship between witness and fate, and he had found himself at the observation window of Processing Room C. The glass was one way. Standard. He could see in. No one inside could see him. The superior was there, standing at the far wall with a data tablet in one hand, looking bored in the way of someone who has seen this so many times that it has become administrative. 2 technicians in white worked at a console. In the chair, which was the kind of chair you never wanted to see up close, high-backed and fitted with conductors at the armrests and temples, was the girl. She was awake. That was the first thing Kade registered, and it was the thing that unmade him. She was awake. She was looking at her hands with an expression that was not fear anymore, because fear requires the capacity to anticipate, and what he was watching in real time was the removal of that capacity. Her power left her first. He could see it. The veiled always could, the shimmer that had been leaking from her in the tunnels drawn inward and then out, extracted the way a splinter is extracted, except that a splinter is foreign matter, and this was not. This was hers. This was what she was. And then her face changed. It was not dramatic. That was the cruelest part. There was no scream. No violent resistance. The machines were precise. The girl sat in the chair and her expression did not transform so much as it evacuated, the way a room empties when everyone leaves, not destroyed, just no longer occupied. The fear went. The prayer went. The shaking of her hands slowed and stopped, not because she had calmed herself, but because the self that had been doing the calming was no longer present to do it. She looked at her hands in the chair with eyes that were perfectly clear and perfectly empty, and the superior made a note on the tablet, and the technicians powered down the console. Kade stood at the window and could not move. He was still holding the book. He had let her go. He had let her go, and they had found her anyway, through the detection grid, through informants, through whatever method the Veil's machinery always eventually used, and his mercy had been not mercy at all but delay. A 9-day reprieve before the same destination. He submitted his resignation the following week. The superior denied it. The Veil does not accept resignations. The Veil accepts retirements and deaths and transfers, and, when necessary, it accepts the kind of disappearance that leaves no forwarding address. Kade chose the last option. He left the collar in his office, where it sat on his desk like a severed thing. He left the book too. He walked out through a service entrance at 3 in the morning, and he did not look back, and in the 6 years since he had never stopped seeing her face, the girl in the chair, the light going out of her eyes. The moment when she stopped being someone and became simply a body that continued to breathe. That face was the reason he was in Veilport. That face was the reason he'd compiled 3 files on the Ashening. That face was the reason he had walked into an alley behind a woman's apothecary at dawn and said, "We need to talk." Present day, a derelict warehouse, Veilport Docklands. The warehouse had been derelict for 11 years, which in Veilport's Docklands meant it had been repurposed for everything from veiled gathering space to ley line monitoring to exactly the sort of tense, ill-advised midnight conversation now taking place between its remaining standing walls. Ayla Voss stood with her back to a support beam, her indigo ritual coat wrapped tight despite the fact that the night was not cold. It was the posture of someone keeping something in, not keeping something out. Her silver-streaked hair was loose around her face. Her violet-gray eyes had not moved from the man across from her for 6 minutes. Kade Morrow stood precisely 8 feet away from her, which she had specifically and silently established by taking 1 step backward when he had initially stood at 6 feet, and which he had noted without comment. His charcoal coat was open. His hands were at his sides. His amber-brown eyes were entirely human at the moment, which she recognized as something he was doing deliberately, as a kind of good faith gesture, the way someone places a weapon on a table rather than holding it. From somewhere in the cavernous dark of the warehouse interior, the lumen hound made a soft, anxious sound. It had been making that sound since they had begun speaking. It did not like tension. It absorbed it the way Ayla absorbed wounds, indiscriminately and at cost. Ayla forced the conversation directly to the Ashening, refusing to give Kade room for mystery or ceremony. At that hour, behind her shop, she wanted facts, not context. Kade told her that 3 veiled individuals in the Docklands had been emptied in the last 40 days, their magic gone first, then their memories, then whatever remained of the self that made them recognizable as people. Ayla already knew the shape of the illness, but Kade pressed the point that mattered most. The Ashening was not natural. Someone was making it happen. Something moved in his expression, not offense and not amusement exactly, but the particular reaction of a person encountering someone who is operating at their own pace and finding it, against their inclinations, a little refreshing. He shifted his weight. One of the smoke wisps that curled from his coat hem when his shade ability simmered drifted upward and dissolved at shoulder height. The harbor wind shifted. A loose panel of the warehouse wall groaned. Ayla let the silence sit for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was thinking, and she thought the way surgeons move, precisely, without wasted motion. Ayla demanded to know who he was beyond a name. Kade gave her the essential truth. He was a shade, once a Veil Enforcer, and he had walked away 6 years earlier. Ayla knew enough of the Veil to understand the danger in that statement. The Veil did not accept resignations. Kade did not pretend otherwise. He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask him to. The gap where an explanation might have gone was its own kind of answer, the kind that says, "I am not going to lie to you, but I am not going to give you everything either. Not yet, not here." She looked at his throat. The skin there was smooth, unmarked. But she had enough experience with veil suppression technology to know what she was looking for, and she looked anyway because old habits of assessment did not care about social grace. When Ayla pressed him about what being a shade meant, Kade let the ability surface just enough for her to see it. The amber brown of his eyes deepened until darkness bled into the irises, and smoke thickened at the hem of his coat. In the warehouse, he read fear, pain, and recent relief, likely residue from Ayla's healing work, and beneath all of it, an older hurt embedded so deeply in the building that it felt almost structural. He let the ability recede. His eyes returned to amber brown. He said nothing further. He didn't look at her as though he expected credit for the demonstration. Ayla uncrossed her arms. It was the first unconscious movement she'd made, a gesture her body had decided on before her mind authorized it, which she recognized immediately and filed away as information about herself that she did not particularly welcome. Kade explained that he had returned to Veilport because the Ashening had begun there, and because the Veil either did not know or did not care enough to stop it. He needed Ayla because the victims were still alive, and a midnight healer might be the only person capable of reaching through what the Ashening left behind to discover what had been done and by whom. Ayla refused trust, refused obligation, and refused to share anything about her methods or movements. Kade accepted every boundary without argument. Only when he made clear that no moral debt bound her to the victims, but that someone had weaponized the city's own ley lines, did she remain still long enough for the decision to form. From the dark interior, the lumen hound settled near her boot, and that small act seemed to finish what neither of them could say. Ayla agreed to see the files. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. Then, if you're enjoying this, make sure you smash that like button, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to join the community. And hit that notification bell so you're first to see new episodes. Veilport Harborside Rail Station, 6:14 a.m. Inspector Dara Holt stepped off the train with a single bag, a closed expression, and the particular quality of stillness that very perceptive people carry as a default, not calm exactly, but observational, the way a naturalist holds still in a field. Not because they are at rest, but because they are watching everything. She was 41. Medium height, compact build, brown skin, and close-cropped natural hair just beginning to gray at the temples. She wore a charcoal blazer over a pressed white shirt and the kind of low-heeled boots that said "I walk everywhere, and I am prepared for anything" in the same breath. Her Veil credentials were in her interior breast pocket, not visible but accessible in the way that a professional carries what she needs without displaying it unnecessarily. She had been an inspector for 12 years. She had seen 9 cities. She did not consider herself a remarkable person. She considered herself a thorough one. On the train, in the 2 hours before Veilport, she had read the file. It was labeled, in the bureaucratic neutrality the Veil preferred, Veilport Region, Anomalous Healing Events, Class 3, Ongoing Review. Inside, 3 case summaries. A dock worker who had sustained a severe spinal injury in a loading accident and been found 6 hours later walking out of the hospital unaided, all imaging normal, the attending physician's notes describing it as a diagnostic irregularity that requires further workup in the anxious way of someone who knows they are looking at something impossible and is trying to find a corner of language to fit it into. A woman from the Veiled community's secondary register who had presented with late-stage pulmonary illness and been discharged to hospice care, only to appear at her sister's door 3 weeks later, every test clean. The hospice physician baffled and the sister weeping. A teenager, 17, Veilport local, Veiled registry entry pending, who had been brought into an emergency room with injuries from a street assault and who had apparently undergone, in the words of the attending, spontaneous and unexplained full tissue recovery over 4 hours. 3 events. Veilport. 18 months. Dara had read the case notes twice. Then she had read the Ashening incident reports appended to the back of the file, also 3 cases, also Veilport, also recent, and she had looked out the train window at the approaching coast, and she had thought, someone is here. Someone is healing, and someone is destroying, and these things are happening in the same city at the same time, and that is not a coincidence. The junior agent who met her on the platform was 24, eager in the manner of someone who had recently passed their Veil assessments and not yet discovered the ways in which competence and institutional loyalty were sometimes imperfectly aligned. His name was Lorne. He had dark hair and an expression of conscientious anxiety. Agent Lorne greeted Inspector Holt with rehearsed professionalism, but Dara immediately redirected him to the Docklands detection grid. She already knew the answer before he found it. A 1:17 a.m. ley line spike in Sector 4 had been dismissed as infrastructure variance, just as the previous healing events had been. Dara identified the pattern with calm precision and pushed him past the obvious registry lists toward the person who truly did not belong in the city. He blinked, reached for his tablet. Lorne opened his mouth, then closed it. He had the look of someone recalibrating. Under her steady prompting, Lorne finally named the answer: former Enforcer Kade Morrow, flagged on a ley line resonance scanned 3 weeks earlier, 6 years absent from the Veil's active files. Dara gave him the next tasks without hesitation: Morrow's last confirmed location pings, his assessment record, all Ashening case files from the last 90 days, and the business license records for every apothecary, herbal supplier, and traditional medicine practitioner in Veilport. She had already counted 43 such businesses on the train. She stepped through the station's main doors into the gray Veilport morning, into air that smelled of salt and industry and something underneath both. The particular mineral tang of ley line energy that people with the Veil's training learned to identify the way a sommelier identifies minerality in wine. She breathed it in. She looked at the city. She had been in cities where something was wrong, cities where the magic had gone sour at the edges, where the Veiled lived too small and too frightened, where things happened in the dark that should not have been permitted in daylight. She had fixed those cities, or she had filed the reports that eventually led to those cities being fixed, which was not always the same thing, but she had done her work. She would do her work here too. She was not interested in punishment, not for its own sake. She was interested in order, in the safety of the magical population, in the Veil's purpose as she understood it, the protection of the Veiled, the maintenance of the concealment that kept them alive in a world that was not, historically speaking, safe for those who were different in ways that defied ordinary explanation. She believed in this. She believed in it genuinely, the way someone can believe in an institution and be dangerous precisely because of the sincerity of that belief. She noted the direction of the harbor. She noted the neighborhood markers. She noted, without being able to say exactly why, that the ley line tang was stronger to the east. Veil Care Facility, Docklands District, morning. The Veil operated 14 care facilities across the eastern seaboard, which it described in internal communications as stabilization and support residences for veiled individuals experiencing magical distress or capacity loss. The Veilport facility occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a converted maritime insurance building near the Docklands, with windows that looked out at the harbor and smelled faintly of the sea. It was not an unpleasant building. The staff were not unkind. The rooms were clean and adequately lit, and there was a small garden on the 4th floor accessible to those residents who were ambulatory. The 3 residents in question were all ambulatory. That was the thing. They moved when directed. They ate when food was placed in front of them. They responded to their names in the way that a light switch responds to being flipped, mechanically, without apparent interiority. The oldest of them, a 62-year-old man named Eden who had been, prior to the Ashening, a registered veiled practitioner of spatial mechanics and an amateur woodcarver of some local renown, sat most of each day in a chair by his window and watched the harbor. His hands were folded in his lap. He had not asked for anything since his admission. He had not reached for anything, commented on anything, laughed at anything. He breathed and he sat, and he watched the water with eyes that registered light without responding to it. The second was a 34-year-old woman named Pell, a shade of low classification who had worked as a night security consultant for 3 veiled businesses in the Docklands. She now sat at a table in the common room with a cup of tea in front of her, both hands wrapped around the mug, her gaze fixed on the middle distance between the table surface and the far wall. The tea was cold. She had not drunk it. The third was a boy of 20. His name was Solis. He had been, 3 months ago, noisy and restless and full of nervous, vital energy. A minor elemental practitioner, his power barely registered in the grid, but his presence apparently enormous in the life of everyone who knew him, the way some people are. His admitting notes, filed by a veiled community advocate who had brought him in, included the sentence, "He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee order and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them." He now lay in his bed in the posture of someone simply waiting for nothing, his eyes open to the ceiling, his expression vacant as a cleared blackboard. Kade brought Ayla to the facility through a side entrance, through a nurse-supervisor contact he described only as someone who owes me something and understands the situation. He did not elaborate. Ayla did not ask. They had 40 minutes. She stood in the doorway of Eden's room first. Just stood there for a moment, which surprised Kade. He'd expected her to move to the patient immediately, the way medical people always move to the immediate, the actionable. But she stood in the doorway and she looked at the old man in the chair by the window, and she was very still. He watched her face. He was good at watching people's faces. He had spent years in the dark looking at people who did not know they were being observed, reading the things they thought they were keeping private. Ayla Voss's face was not easy to read, but it was not unreadable. What he saw in it now was not pity. It was something more disciplined than pity, a practitioner's recognition, careful and sorrowful, like a surgeon looking at a scan and seeing what the damage actually is. Not removing oneself from feeling, but not letting the feeling run ahead of the knowledge. He respected it without meaning to. She crossed the room slowly and knelt beside Eden's chair. Not standing over him, beside, at eye level. She looked at his hands, folded in his lap. She looked at his face. He did not look back at her. Ayla addressed Eden softly by name and explained, more for dignity than expectation, that she was only going to look for a moment. He gave no sign of hearing her. She held her palm near his folded hands without touching him, closed her eyes, and read the ruined landscape of what remained. No response. She had not expected one. She reached out and very gently placed her palm near his folded hands, not touching, hovering half an inch above the skin, and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. The violet gray of her eyes was invisible behind her lids, but the faint shimmer around her fingertips was not, the barely perceptible luminous edge that was a midnight healer reading the landscape of a body, mapping what it had been and what it was now. After 30 seconds, she withdrew her hand and opened her eyes. She stood and walked to the window without speaking. Kade waited by the door. Outside, the harbor moved and gleamed in the morning light, and Eden watched it without seeing it. What she found was worse than injury. There was nothing left to heal. His magic had not been blocked or suppressed. The capacity itself had been removed, as if someone had taken the part of him that knew how to hold power. Without that anchor, identity, memory, and will had begun to fall away in sequence. Kade confirmed that the pattern matched every Ashening case he had seen, magic first, then the memories tied to being veiled, then personal memory, and finally the hollow stillness now sitting by the window. She looked at the old man for another moment. Then she said, very quietly, not as a question. Kade did not know what to say to that. So he said nothing, and they stood in the morning light of an old man's room with the sound of the harbor beyond the glass, and for a moment neither of them was a former enforcer or a hidden healer or an alliance of convenience. They were two people who understood what loss looked like and were sitting with it, which is a different thing from fixing it and harder than either of them would have admitted. They saw Pell next, then Solis. The experience was different in each room and exactly the same in its essential quality, the wrongness. The wrongness of a person present and absent simultaneously, alive and emptied. Ayla conducted her assessments with the same careful precision, kneeling level with the patient, one palm hovering, eyes closed, breath slowing. She found the same thing in each of them, the capacity gone, not suppressed, not wounded, taken. A surgical removal. Something that required intimate knowledge of how veiled physiology housed its power. Something that required either extraordinary expertise or a very specific tool. When they left Solis's room, Kade closed the door behind them in the corridor and Ayla stood with her back to the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, which he recognized without having any right to recognize it, as the posture of someone not allowing themselves to feel what they are feeling until they have somewhere appropriate to feel it. His shade ability simmered at the edges of him, the wisps curling and dispersing, and he knew what the residual emotion in this corridor was. He could feel it without trying, could not stop feeling it. Grief. Rage at the controlled grain of grief. The discipline it took to keep caring about people you couldn't save. He looked away from her and at the far wall, giving her privacy, which was the only thing he had to offer that she hadn't already refused. She finally looked at him. Her violet gray eyes were steady. Whatever she had been managing in the corridor, whatever she had not permitted herself to feel in the rooms, had been placed somewhere internal, not discarded, not hidden, just held. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person they are in the process of deciding about. She absorbed this. Then she pushed off the wall and straightened her coat and said, "It was not a compliment, and not quite a complaint, a third thing, an acknowledgement that existed in the narrow space between them where neither trust nor distrust had yet staked its full claim." They walked out of the facility the same way they'd entered, through the side corridor, out the unmarked door, into the Veilport morning that smelled of salt and distance and old stone. Outside the warehouse, Dockland Street, late morning. They stood outside the warehouse in the late morning light, which had the quality of light in port cities, diffuse, silver-edged, as though filtered through the memory of fog. The street was not busy. A man walked a dog in the distance. The harbor smell carried easily here. They had been arguing, mildly, for 4 minutes about the terms of the arrangement, and the argument had arrived at the specific kind of standstill that happens not because neither party has anything left to say, but because they have arrived at the point where what they have left to say is too important to say carelessly. They were both standing at angles to each other, which was not unconscious. It was the body language of two people who have agreed not to be too direct yet. Ayla set the terms with clinical clarity. She would review the ley line data and give Kade her assessment of the mechanism, and nothing about that exchange would imply an ongoing alliance. If the analysis led to something actionable, they would negotiate again, separately. Kade recognized what she wanted, a series of independent decisions she could walk away from at any time without breach. He found it reasonable. She already knew that. A seagull landed on a nearby bollard and regarded them with the frank disinterest of something that has no stake in human drama. Kade looked at it briefly, then at her. She looked at him with an expression of such flat patience that he heard, without her saying it, the clear message, "Of course you don't, that is not an accident." He took the paper. He didn't unfold it. She watched him put it in his pocket and his hands returned to his sides, and she noticed, against her better judgment, she noticed that his hands were still. Not fidgety, not restless. Whatever emotional weather he had inside him, it did not reach his hands. That was a specific kind of discipline. She recognized it because she had it too, and she knew what it cost. She turned to go. She had taken 4 steps when he said. Ayla stopped walking. Did not turn around immediately. Ayla turned. Her expression had closed, the shutters going up, the professional mask taking its position over whatever had been briefly visible in the care facility corridors. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the space between them, the seagull lifted from the bollard and flew toward the harbor without apparent concern for the gravity of the moment. She walked. He watched her go, not with the particular attention of a man watching a woman, but with the vigilance of a former enforcer watching someone he has just agreed to be responsible for, which is a different and weightier thing. The smoke wisps at his coat hem moved in the salt wind. There were things he hadn't said. He counted them, the way he counted everything. 3. The first was that the Veil Inspector's file on the healing events included 2 details that matched Voss and Veil Apothecary's registered location. The second was that his contacts inside the Veil had told him the Ashening was not the only ongoing situation in Veilport, that there were signatures in the ley line data that suggested a secondary event, something different. Something that was watching the Ashening the way a second predator watches a first work its territory. The third was the thing he could not have said even if he had wanted to, because he did not have the words for it yet. The recognition, sitting somewhere below language in the part of him that read darkness and shadow and emotional residue. That Ayla Voss was carrying something enormous, and had been carrying it alone for a very long time, and that she was doing it, all of it, with a quality of patient, determined love for people she had never met and would never be thanked by, and that this was either the bravest or the saddest thing he had seen in 6 years, and he could not decide which. He decided not to count it. He walked the other way. Voss and Veil Apothecary, back room, late afternoon, becoming evening. Voss and Veil Apothecary was, to all visible inspection, an ordinary small business in an ordinary commercial block, 3 floors down from a dentist's office, 2 doors up from a Vietnamese grocery. On a street where the parking was difficult and the coffee shop next door served the kind of oat milk cordido that Veilport's slowly gentrifying dockland-adjacent blocks had begun to require. It had been Ayla's grandmother's business, and her grandmother's mother's before that. And the name Vine had belonged to a great-aunt who had died before Ayla was born, and whose photograph still sat in a small frame above the register, because removing it had never felt right. The front of the shop was herbs, tinctures, beeswax candles, locally sourced honey, dried flower arrangements, and a small rotating selection of artisanal soaps that Ayla did not make herself, but that her supplier, a woman named Greta, who kept bees in a garden 8 miles east, made with extraordinary care. The shop smelled of lavender and calendula and cedar and thyme. Its ordinary customers were a mix of the neighborhood's older residents who had been coming for decades and a newer generation who found comfort in the physical, the botanical, the tactile certainty of glass jars with paper labels. The back room was different. Not in a way you'd see if you were simply passing through. It looked like a preparation room, which it was, fitted with a long table and shelves of more specialized supplies and a door that led to the alley. But the floor in the back room was laid over a direct ley line node, which was not an accident, and the walls had been lined, 1 generation back, with a specific mineral compound that attenuated magical resonance, which meant that anything Ayla did in the back room was considerably less visible to veil detection systems than anything done in the ordinary world. It was not invisible. It was merely quieter. The difference, in her line of work, had kept her operational for 4 years. She stood at the center of the back room now, coat off, indigo ritual coat hung on its hook by the door, in a heavy knit sweater and worn trousers. With her silver-streaked hair loosely coiled and her sleeves pushed to the elbows and a cup of tea going cold on the table behind her because she had forgotten it was there. Her hands were pressed flat against the floor. She was kneeling. This was not prayer, and it was not meditation, though it looked like both from the outside. It was assessment, the midnight healer's method of reading a ley line directly, palm to the node, breathing slow and deep, letting the line's vibration travel up through the bones of her hands and arms and into the part of her that understood it. The line was wrong. Not catastrophically. Not severed. Not corrupted in any visible way. But the vibration that she had grown up feeling, that she had learned to read the way a blind person learns to read by touch, its particular frequency, its rhythm, the specific quality of its warmth, was different tonight. It had been slightly different for 2 weeks, she now realized, and she had been telling herself the difference was fatigue or seasonal shift in the line's activity or her own diminished vitality after the healing in the docklands. She had been wrong. The line was not tired. The line was not shifting with the season. The line was afraid. She did not have a better word for it. She had spoken once, years ago, with an older midnight healer, the last one she had met before understanding that she was the last one, full stop, who had told her that ley lines were not sentient, not exactly, but were responsive in the way that large bodies of water are responsive, not feeling, but recording, carrying, amplifying. What they carried now was not the ordinary flow of magical energy through Veilport's foundations. It was something elevated, something urgent. The ley lines of Veilport were humming at a frequency that was not their own, and the hum had been building. She could hear it now that she was listening, could feel it distinctly in the palms of her hands pressed against the floor, building in the way that a sound builds when its source is approaching. She sat back on her heels. She looked at her hands. The faint luminous edge that marked a midnight healer's skin during active reading was still visible at her fingertips, not a glow, just an edge, like the light at the rim of a cloud. She let it fade. She breathed out. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in the cold dark of the back room for a moment, not meditating, just sitting with the information, letting it be what it was without immediately trying to make it manageable. Something was moving through the ley lines. Something that was not a healing. Something that did not have the bright, clean signature of the energy she drew on and returned and paid for in vitality and sleepless witching windows. This was darker, denser, deliberate. It moved in the lines the way a foreign substance moves through a bloodstream, not belonging, but present and spreading. The Ashening mechanism. She was certain, with the particular certainty of someone whose body knows things before their mind catches up. The Ashening was using the ley lines. Not just as a backdrop, not just incidentally, it was using them as its delivery system. Someone had found a way to weaponize the very infrastructure of magical Veilport to run the plague through the city's own veins. Which meant the scope was not 3 people. The scope was not the docklands. The scope was the whole city. She got to her feet. She crossed to the table and put her hands flat on its surface, grounding herself in the physical, the solid, the immediate, and looked at nothing for a moment. Then she picked up the cold tea and drank half of it in 3 swallows, because she was practical, and because the action of drinking something was the body's most basic assertion of its own continuity, and she needed to assert continuity right now. She would need to contact Kade. Not in the morning. She would need to move faster than the morning. But she was not going to go back out tonight. She had healed 2 nights ago. She was operating at roughly 60% vitality. Going out again without sleep was the kind of decision that midnight healers made only when people were dying and no alternative presented itself. And the people in the care facility had already been made unable to be helped by her, and the people not yet reached by the Ashening were not, as far as she knew, actively in crisis at this. Ayla went still. The shop was closed. She had closed it at 5 o'clock, as she always did, turning the sign and drawing the half-shade on the door glass and switching off the front lights. It was past 6 now. The street outside was in the early dark of the evening, the lampposts lit, the grocery next door still open and spilling warm yellow light onto the pavement. 3 knocks. Soft. Hesitant. She moved through the back room to the door that connected to the shop floor, opened it a crack. The shop was dark except for the lamppost light coming through the half-shade on the front door. She stood in the doorway and looked through the dimness toward the front glass. She crossed the shop floor in 6 steps and stood at the front door and looked through the glass. A woman was collapsed on the front step. She was on her side, her back against the door, her cheek against the cold stone of the step's edge. One hand was raised, it had been raised, was still raised, in the last voluntary gesture before the body could no longer manage voluntary gestures, reaching for the door handle. The fingers not quite touching it. As though she had made it this far on wool alone, and the wool had run out 6 inches short. She was perhaps 55. Dark coat. A knit hat, slightly askew. Sensible shoes. Her eyes were open, and in the low light from the street they had the particular quality of eyes that are present but not processing. Not the blank vacancy of the care facility's Ashening victims. Not yet, but the first withdrawal. The beginning of the retreat. Ayla looked at her face. She looked at it for one long moment, and what happened in her was not dramatic, it was very quiet, very deep, a recognition that dropped through her like a stone through water, settling somewhere low in her chest and staying there. She knew this woman. Not well, not closely, but she knew her the way you know the people who form the ordinary weave of a life, the customers who become part of the texture of your days, who you look forward to without quite naming why. This woman came in on Tuesdays. She had been coming in on Tuesdays for 3 years. She bought lavender oil and dried rosemary and occasionally, in winter, the eucalyptus balm that Ayla made in the back room from a recipe her grandmother had left in a water-stained notebook. Last Tuesday, 6 days ago, 6 days, she had stood at the counter with a small paper bag of lavender oil, and she had told Ayla about her cat. A gray cat, elderly, who had developed a preference for sitting in the bathroom sink and could not be dissuaded from this preference regardless of what was offered as an alternative. She had told the story with the particular delight of someone who finds the small absurdities of domestic life genuinely, specifically wonderful. She had laughed at the end of it. A real laugh, full and warm, the kind that arrives before the joke is quite finished because the person telling it loves it too much to wait. Her name was Yolanda. Ayla knew it from the credit card she used, which she always presented upside down because she had never learned to hold a card the right way in its first decade of use and had simply committed to the upside-down method as a lifestyle. The card said Y. Marchetti. Every Tuesday. Yolanda Marchetti was on Ayla's front step with her hand reaching for the door handle and her eyes beginning to go, and the ley lines were humming with fear beneath the floor, and Ayla stood on the inside of the door in the dark of her closed shop and did not move. The thing she was feeling was not fear, precisely. It was more specific than fear. It was the particular terrible paralysis of knowing exactly what she was and what she was capable of and exactly what it would cost and exactly what it would mean. Not just the vitality, not just the exhaustion of the witching window, but the exposure. The inspector who had arrived this morning on the 614. The veil detection nodes in the Docklands grid. The careful 4-year architecture of being invisible, of keeping herself small enough to keep herself free, of protecting the last midnight healer by not allowing the last midnight healer to be seen. And Yolanda Marchetti on her step with her hand raised and the light already beginning to leave her eyes. In the back room behind her, the floor hummed. Ayla Voss stood between the door and the darkness, between the healer she was and the hidden woman she had made herself, between the woman on the step who had laughed about her cat last Tuesday and every careful thing she had built to protect herself and the future of what she carried in her blood. She stood there with her hand on the door and the street light coming through the glass and the particular silence of a moment in which everything that comes after depends on what you do in it. She stood there. End of episode 2. If you're enjoying this, make sure you smash that like button, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to join the community. And hit that notification bell so you're first to see new episodes. Next episode, The Witching Window, Episode 3. The Healing That Cannot Be Hidden. Inspector Holt draws closer. Kade reads the shadows of a city that is keeping secrets. And beneath it all, the ley lines of Veilport answer a question no one has yet thought to ask.